this is exactly it, which is why I think these podcasts are so amazing, because I think the result of it, or part of the result of them, are going to be that there's a whole generation of composers who may not even be born yet, but certainly, there's going to be a lot who haven't written a note of music in their lives yet, who, as they explore music and explore composing, are going to sit and listen to these, and they're going to hear composers talk about how difficult it is. But you know what? You'll know that you're not the only one finding it difficult.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode 44. Joining me is composer Peter Meechan. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening and for your support. I'd like to ask if you can help me in a couple of ways. I rely on word of mouth to spread the show to new listeners. If you think you know of one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Pete.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Glad to be back in the office after Christmas.
Yeah, it's that post-holiday week. It's always a little odd to get back into the swing of things. Yeah,
well, after Chicago before Christmas and being so close to Christmas, then a week off over Christmas, I'm kind of excited to be back and writing and recovering from New Year.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you introduce yourself for the listeners who may not know your name?
Yeah, I'm Pete Meechan. I'm a British composer, originally from the middle of England, very near to Birmingham, and then spent most of my adult life up in Manchester, England, which is a significantly more famous city and an incredible city for music and the arts. And then 4 years ago, I moved over to Canada, to Saskatchewan, and then I now live in Winnipeg. I'm a composer and part-time conductor, and just generally someone who enjoys life and music.
Thanks for joining me. Can you tell everybody your origin story, how you got started in music and what you did as a child?
I can give it a go. It's a difficult question to answer, really, because I don't remember not being in music, as it were. My parents were both, and still are, folk musicians. So from a very young age, I was in a pushchair, being taken to folk festivals and surrounded by singing and playing and dancing and all the kind of fun parts of music. And I always remember music being on in the house of whatever type. It wasn't often folk music in the house. It was often the Beatles. There was a lot of classical music, and my grandmother was certainly a huge Beethoven fan. And so I think from day one, I was just always surrounded by music. So to me, it always feels a bit strange when people aren't surrounded by music from the first day, because that's my only experience.
Mm-hmm. And so what was your first instrument as a child?
Oh, man. My first instrument as a child, this is a confession. I played the violin.
I see.
Yes.
And what's your instrument now?
Well, I graduated from violin to double bass and was a pianist as well, although neither of which I play in any serious manner anymore. I don't really have time to, if no other reason, just too busy composing. But I certainly didn't get the enjoyment out of performing and playing music as I do out of writing music.
So, Pete, I want to ask you about being a child growing up in England, and sort of, you have a different system than we do in the United States. You know, we have our school bands and our middle school and high school bands. And in England, the ensemble experience is in community bands, principally?
So essentially music, and this is an ever-changing thing, so this may not be completely accurate compared to what's exactly happening now, but music was a prescribed thing in the classroom by the rules of the national curriculum, which is what the whole nation has to learn from in school. Music and the arts had to play a role in a child's education, and it would be mainly classroom music, maybe some off type things. But there wouldn't be any concept of band teaching within the classroom. There would maybe be a lunchtime or after school band or orchestra or maybe a choir. But really, most of the band-related opportunities, either wind band or in the main brass band, were community-led things for sure.
And so I know that in England, there's lots of brass bands that are competitive, and I assume some community bands are as well. Is it welcoming to young people in these community bands? Are there some that are some more amateur than others?
Yeah, well, I think technically they're all amateur, but of course, I think the way you put it was very nice there. Some are more amateur than others. There's a grade system which is used for competing. So if you're a Section 4 band, a fourth section, generally you play pretty easy music all the way up to the championship section where you play music that is off the charts, difficult. So, of course, that provides a natural sort of place for absolutely everybody, no matter what age. But then there's a youth band system that comes sort of parallel with that, which it tended to be smaller band organizations that would have a youth band as well. But now more and more, all the very big famous brass bands, Foden's, Black Dyke, they all now have youth band programs alongside their senior bands.
Suddenly, I'm sort of drawing parallels to lots of different things in English society and culture. And one of the things is that I'm a bit of a soccer fan, a football fan, and I know that those teams, those club teams in England that are now the professional teams, started out as in their local towns and their local factories and local organizations. So it's similar with the brass or with the band. Boy, I messed that up completely, didn't I? So it's similar with the music.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, I think actually soccer, which is probably my specialist subject in life. I'm a Liverpool fan, or a long life Liverpool sufferer, I should maybe say. I think that more and more that's changed in the modern era, but certainly what you described was what would happen in days gone by, that you would maybe play for your local, you'd play for your high school team, and then maybe you'd be picked up by a local club team, and you'd work your way up through the leagues and divisions until you played in the Premier League and earned, your millions of dollars for kicking a ball, which all sounded like a nice living to me, to be honest, but I didn't quite make it. But it is a very similar system in that regard.
So as a young musician, you could start in a youth band and then play maybe in a smaller or lower class band and then work your way up?
Yep, absolutely.
Is there much movement around the bands?
I think, again, this is something that more and more, the answer is yes. Of course, going back even 30 years, that would have been less of a thing because transport was less accessible to people, and so generally you would stay in your local area. I mean, if you were in Yorkshire, where a lot of the famous bands are from, there would maybe be 30 or 40 bands within a few miles radius, and they would all play to a very high level. And so certainly you would have access to moving around all those. Now in the modern era, a great band like Black Dyke, I remember when I was involved with them, they had players traveling 300 miles to band, such as the pull of such a significant and brilliant ensemble. So that for sure. But the other thing to kind of note with the brass bands is that often it would start by little Johnny or little Jane. She would want to play the cornet like Daddy, so Dad or uncle or granddad would teach them the cornet at a very young age, maybe single digits, 5, 6, 7. And then gradually, once the family teaching kind of reached its peak, you'd then maybe get taught by the bandmaster in the band. And then eventually you'd move on to maybe a principal cornet of one of the bigger bands. Or maybe by that stage you've moved on to euphonium or onto tuba or whatever instrument. And so there was a natural sort of community aspect even to the teaching.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting, actually. Can you tell me about the Black Dyke Brass Band and your experience with that? And just for the listeners who don't know the British brass band world, that's one of the great bands in the world. And so maybe if you can just give a little bit of explanation of that.
Yeah, well, they are historically, I think, the band that's won the most and certainly I'm sure amongst your listeners, they would be the most famous brass band. They are from a little village called Queensbury in West Yorkshire, which is pretty unremarkable, other than the fact that it had the Black Dyke Mill there, a textiles company, and around 150, 160 years ago, they purchased a set of Adolf Sax's brand new sax horns and set up a brass band there, which it wasn't from scratch. There was originally a reed band there, so they'd have basically whatever combination of instruments that they had in the cupboard, and the bandmaster at the mill would arrange whatever famous overtures or whatever famous music of the day for that particular ensemble. And just to touch on that a lot of those industries, so mills, coal mines, etc., they would all have their own musical group. In the case of coal mines, for instance, they would be paid as miners, but actually very rarely go down the mine. They would be paid to practice all day. And so these guys would be professional miners and amateur musicians was the theory, but actually it was more like professional musicians and amateur miners. That's really interesting. And so what was the value to the mine company? I think it was prestige, for sure. I think there was an element of, they represented the mill or the mine. And if you had something that sounded brilliant, maybe the clothes they produced were brilliant, et cetera, et cetera. And also there was the competitions that began happening. And so, if the Black Dyke Mill Band would beat the Grindthorpe Colliery Band, then, that was certainly a feather in your cap. Yeah, I guess it's a form of advertising. For sure, yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating that it would develop that way. It's such a different thing. I keep coming back to that. Let's get back to you, Pete, and let's talk about sort of what happened next. So you mentioned that you started on the violin, you switched to double bass. How did you get involved in winds and brass? Well, I think, so I left school at 16, as many people did in my town back then, and went to North Warwickshire College. This was a 16 to 18 college where you could specialize in a whole series of areas. If you wanted to be a mechanic, you would go off and do an apprenticeship and learn those skills. I went and did music and music technology alongside a few other subjects like math and chemistry, which I didn't really pass. So I will forget about that for a minute. But music and music technology was my real focus by this point. And there they had a concert band that would, again, it was a community ensemble run by the college that would meet on a Thursday night. And it was conducted by Jim Norden. Jim was a wonderful conductor and a great pedagogue, someone who was very, very encouraging of everyone around him. And his wife, Judy, was both my piano teacher at college, and also she was the head of the department. And she sort of very much took me under her wing, and I think she had to be very patient with me because I'm sure I wasn't always the easiest. I seem to remember spending time in her office when I'd maybe been kicked out of some theory lessons at some stage. But yeah, she was great. She just took really good care of me. And so she realized composing was where my heart was. And between her and Jim, they encouraged me to write for that concert band, which I did, and wrote a couple of pieces between 16 and 18. But then I didn't really do anything for any kind of band for a couple of years. I moved up to Manchester when I got a place at the Royal Northern College of Music. And it's a very famous institute for wind and brass bands. And gradually over time, I'd be working till late in the day in one of the composition suites, and I'd come down for a quick drink. We had a bar in the college, a bar in a music college. I mean, that was a disaster waiting to happen, I think. It was subsidized as well. But the amazing thing was, actually, still to this day, I think a lot of my career stems from that bar. And I think a lot of people who went to that college would say the same, because it's where you had a drink with your tutors, who would then maybe take you in to the local orchestras to bump on horn or to play offstage trumpet, or it may be it's where I met people who would go on to be colleagues and commission music, etc., etc. And so it was actually a great a great melting pot for all of those kind of things. But when I was at college, you'd come downstairs for a quick drink after you're working all day in the composition suite, and the bar would be full of brass players, inevitably, who had many of whom had just come back from the brass band rehearsals on the evening, and you'd get talking to them, and very quickly you'd find that they were desperate for repertoire. Especially low brass. Had a lot of very good friends who are wonderful euphonium players. That school was probably one of two schools as a euphonium player that are considered the very best, along with UNT. And so lots of euphonium players would say, "Pete, would you write us a piece? Because we don't have a lot of repertoire." And at that stage, I think that was probably around my third year of college, second or third year of college. And at that time, my composition teacher, Anthony Gilbert, he was encouraging me very much to write for mixed ensemble, maybe flute, saxophone, two violins, cello, and piano, for instance. And the problem with that is that you don't get to hear it performed. I mean, maybe you get to hear it in a workshop situation once, but you don't really get to hear it performed. So you don't really get that incredibly valuable opportunity to analyze your composition and work out what it is that you did that worked, what didn't work, and how you move on from it. Whereas when a euphonium player is saying to you, write me a piece with piano and I'll play it in a recital next week, and then maybe we can record it, and et cetera, et cetera. It was for me personally, that was a huge deal, because having the ability to learn from yourself is, for me, the main thing about being a composer.
Yeah, I think the ability to hear your music early and often is one of the most valuable things for a young composer.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things in there to unpack. I want to go back to the relationships built in the bar. In a lot of ways, you're absolutely right. It's the people that you meet and the relationships that you form that dictate most of your success as a musician. And so that's a really interesting choice. Is that pretty common, that situation with the bar at the university?
Certainly at the Royal Northern College of Music, 100% that is common. And a lot of the people I was at college with have gone on to be very successful musicians. I mean, it's a very good college. And so that, I guess there's a certain inevitability that many of them will go on to have professional careers, either as soloists, orchestral musicians, educators. And in those years at college, because it's I don't know how many people it has now, but it was around 500-600 people in the whole entire college between a 4-year undergrad and a 2-year master's course. So it was a pretty select bunch of people, and so friendships were very naturally formed when you kind of all put together in a situation like that. And like I say, many of them are just great friends that I now get to work with. And actually, maybe I didn't understand the value of that as much then and before I left England as I do now, because I get to travel places to work with these guys, and I only get to see some of my friends a couple of times a year if I'm lucky. But it's through work that I get to see them, and I'm thankful for those opportunities and those days back in Manchester for essentially, not that I realized it at the time, but forming my career.
Yeah. So I'm looking at your catalog of music, and I see lots of low brass music, and you mentioned that it was opportunity. Is there something else about the low brass that attracts you other than that opportunity for a hole in the repertoire, perhaps?
For sure. I mean, this all kind of ties into the question about how did I end up writing for brass bands, I guess, in that because, I mean, there was a practicality to it. Tuba players and euphonium players at the college were desperate for new music, and I was desperate for opportunities. So it was a natural relationship, a natural partnership that developed. But actually, there's something about British euphonium playing and British tuba playing on those E-flat tubas that is just so flexible, but so lyrical. They are truly singing voices. And so to have that flexibility of style and have that flexibility to manipulate alongside these beautiful lyrical voices was something that I just fell in love with. And I think a lot of that is to do with the brass band tradition again in the UK, because alongside the brass band competitions are solo and ensemble competitions, and so it may be a brass quartet competition, or it may be a slow melody competition were a big thing, where people would go and play a beautiful slow melody, and people really learned how to play melody properly, which is something I think sometimes we can be a bit lacking in these days. I think we're a little bit too obsessed with crash bang wallop music a little bit, but and of course the tubas and euphoniums, whilst low instruments, are kind of the tenor instrument in a brass band, because the soprano cornet, of which there's one, is an E flat, so roughly the equivalent to an E flat trumpet, and then the rest are B flat cornets, so equivalent to the B flat trumpet. So there's not a huge amount of high register to deal with there. So actually, once you get into the euphonium, they become a main solo instrument within, pardon me, within the brass band.
Yeah, even the wind band to a certain extent is a really low ensemble compared to the orchestra, and the brass band's even lower than that.
Exactly. They kind of almost have opposite problems, though, the wind ensemble and the brass band, in that, relatively speaking, the brass band is all low end with very little upper end, and the wind ensemble is often a lot of upper end with not a lot of lower end. I often end up writing 2 tuba parts for my wind ensemble pieces, just so that I can make sure that I have the ability to, or I'll know in a performance that I'll get that extra bass end to balance how I want it. Yeah.
That's interesting. And so do you do a tuba 1 and a tuba 2?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, interesting. I've never thought about doing that. That's a really cool idea, actually.
Yeah, and the beauty of that, again, this is a brass band scoring thing, that you'll have the B flat tubas and the E flat tubas, and often they will be in octaves, or they will have that natural, they'll be split into 4. There'll be an octave, fifth, octave. Mm-hmm. That sort of starts the harmonic series.
Right.
And what that really does is make the band sound sparkle, when those guys are in tune at the bottom playing those kind of figurations, the guys at the top get to sit on the harmonic series that's already sort of there for them. And I tend to find that when you have a wind ensemble, you can do the same. If you have those tubas in octaves, it really does make the top of the band sound bright and fresh.
Yeah, that's really good practical compositional advice. Maybe in the weeds for some listeners, but I enjoy it as a composer for sure. Those little scoring tips for brass band.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, let's get back to the main topic at hand here. And I want to ask about your catalog. And I always ask the composers about publication and if they're self-published or commercially published or some combination, and sort of what went into that decision for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess technically I'm both. I think I don't think I've had a piece published by a publisher since maybe 2005. Since then, I've been self-published. That was a fairly easy decision to make on several counts. First of all, I was studying I was at the University of Salford, which is a university in Manchester, studying at postgraduate level. I'm not sure whether it was during my master's or during my doctorate, but my teacher was Peter Graham, who it was a wonderful teacher. He's a brilliant composer, but he also was one of the first composers to self-publish. And what he was great at was not only teaching composition, but he was great at helping composers get set up for a career, which is still something that I think is pretty rare when you look around. And he helped me set up as a self-published composer, and laid out the arguments both ways as to the pros and cons. Now, sort of 10, 15 years later, I think it's a pretty easy decision for any emerging composer to make, to self-publish. I don't really see any benefit to being published by a mainstream publisher.
That's interesting. I just had a couple episodes ago, I spoke with Tyler S. Grant, the young composer.
Yeah.
His model is that he publishes his middle school young band music through a commercial publisher, because he feels like that's the best way to reach that huge market. And then he publishes his higher level stuff self-published. I thought that was an interesting compromise.
Yeah, I think there's a few people that do something similar, and I get that. I think, but I'm loath to give away copyrights.
Yeah, no, I understand.
We're in a ownership is absolutely key for emerging composers, I think, because you want to take charge of your own career. And it's not like maybe 30 or 40 years ago where if a publisher took your piece to publication, it was because they felt it had real artistic merit or could sell 200-300 copies without even thinking about it, because that was kind of their break-even mark. And so they would get recordings and they would publicize it and they would almost be your agent. And so from that point of view, a publisher was, in those days, absolutely essential to forming a career. Now, I don't know that they treat composers like that anymore. And so I think, or at least not many composers get treated like that anymore. And so I think keeping your copyrights and maintaining your control over your career, especially for a younger composer who, as we know, Mark, you get better every piece. Well, that's the theory.
Yep.
And there's certainly some pieces that I maybe quietly withdrawn from publication that I think reflected the best I could do at the time, maybe, but they're not pieces that I would want someone associating with me right now. You know, they're not the pieces that I want to be my calling cards. Once you, as a young composer, give away those pieces, they are no longer yours. And it may be a piece that, as a 40-year-old composer, would cause you great embarrassment, but you have no control over what contracts, the pieces you signed with contracts at the age of 20, you know. And so do you want people to know you for those pieces, or do you want to be in control of those pieces? I see both sides. I really do. I firmly came down on the side of self-publishing. But the problem you mentioned, which is one of how to reach the market, as it were, which isn't a composer's usual mindset from 30 or 40 years ago. It was all about composing. Now it is about being a businessman or woman as well. So we have to kind of adapt and learn a whole new set of skills and see where we go there. I think generally what I found interesting about the Midwest Clinic this year was, this was the first time I had a booth, was the amount of people from different states who select the music lists for festivals, etc., that were coming around, and the message was clear, which was, we know a lot of composers now choose not to go with mainstream publishers, and in fact, some of the comments were not so kind about the music that's published by mainstream publishers now, and they wanted to make sure they continued to get the best possible selection of music on their lists. And so they felt that part of their job was now going around and meeting all these self-published composers. So that's one way that the industry it's behind, but it's definitely adapting. I think the next thing that has to happen is a path for composers, emerging composers, to be able to be discovered, because that's the danger, that a lot of great voices will go unknown or unheard. And so how do we adapt to that? I mean, do we have every major conference? I was talking with a friend in Chicago, in fact, and I said, almost you could do with something at CBDNA where there's a concert of music by composers that have never been performed before at CBDNA, and maybe picked by the conductors of the other concerts as a sort of peer review type panel. And that would be an interesting way to make sure there was always fresh voices coming into our world and being recognized by the conductors. I think it'd also help with an issue that's clearly being identified, where there's definitely a lack of balance when it comes to female composers, composers who don't look like me and you, that really come from backgrounds that have not had so much of a privileged shot at it as we have.
Yeah, no question.
And I feel that if there was more opportunity for emerging composers as a sort of blanket experience, then I think that balance would very, very quickly begin to right itself. And I think we'd find a lot of interesting voices, So I do understand. I do understand the idea of having some of those sort of middle school band type pieces going out on a big publisher, because that's kind of the shortcut to that. But equally, I think that route is also it's got its problems too.
When I sent my first piece to a publisher to be published and it was accepted, my goal was to have 5 or 10 pieces and then return to self-publishing and use it as a way to build street cred. And now I'm sort of in this idea, sort of that Tyler model. And so it's really interesting to hear you gave a really sort of thoughtful and thorough answer to that question. It has me thinking about what I want to do as well with my music.
Well, and I'd also add just one other thing to it, which is that when you are self-published, I sold being in charge of your career and your future as a positive thing, and it most certainly is. But also, you have to be responsible for making sure orders are fulfilled, that orders are printed, that they're sent out, and all that sort of stuff. Now, it may be that you're able to almost subcontract that to somebody or to somewhere, or you employ somebody. That's cool. That's fine. But also, at the very beginning, that isn't what you can do. You don't have that kind of financial backing. So it may be you're coming to a crucial part of the piece you're writing, and you've just pulled a couple of all-nighters in a row, and you know what? You've got to get this sale out tomorrow in the post.
Right.
And that's a balance. You know, that's not something that anyone enjoys.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like we've found the right model yet for the 21st century. There's and I'm going to talk up a couple people here, Pete, if that's okay with you. A friend of mine, Garrett Hope, runs a podcast called The Portfolio Composer, and he talks about business issues, and his whole premise is that all composers are small business owners, and he touches on some of these things. There's another gentleman who's a choral composer, organist in Kansas City, who runs a company called Music Spoke that's mostly choral music at this point, but they have some wins. And he does a model where the composers take a much larger percentage and keep their copyrights. And so he's basically a distribution platform.
Yeah, that's smart.
And he and his wife go to conferences. They go to CBDNA. They go to not the CBDNA. The what's the choral equivalent? The ACDA, and various state conferences. And I think there's some models out there. It's going to be interesting to watch how it develops.
The most interesting model, the one that you basically just talked about there, is essentially one that's existed in written publishing for a long time. You know, when a writer writes a book and they have it published, they don't lose their copyright. It's licensed essentially for a run. You know, and that run may be 200,000 bucks, and then after that, the copyright reverts back to you as the author.
Oh yeah,
which is kind of interesting. So yeah, I think and I understand how we got into the old, or I guess it's not quite old, it's the current, the majority used model, which is the sort of 90%, 10% split between composer and publisher, because publishing was a very, very expensive business 30 or 40 years ago. Now it's simply not. You know, you do not have to pay somebody to engrave copper sheets. You do not have the high printing costs. We have digital printing and Finale and Sibelius. And really, you know, you don't even need the warehouse space to have hundreds of copies of each piece ready to go. You know, the costs have significantly reduced for publishers, and the profits based on that 90% have increased. I mean, maybe it'd be an interesting conversation to have with a publisher, maybe, who would tell me something different. But I don't see how their outgoings are the same now as they were when that deal originally existed. And therefore, keeping the copyrights was important because they needed to manipulate them. You know, they needed to do the easy concert band version of whatever it was, you know, because that's how they made their money.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm trying to have a diversity of voices in both, you know, in every aspect of the band world. So I'm gonna have to get a publisher on at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to talk about these issues. I'd like to hear that other side. This has really been interesting. That was great, Pete. I really appreciate that. What's it like if someone wanted to commission Pete Meechan right now?
You mean how do they contact me, or the process, or all of that?
The process. If I were a band director and I wanted to do a piece of yours and have you write a piece for my ensemble.
So essentially, it comes of only two paths, really. One, if I know the conductor, one, if I don't. If I know the conductor, often the commission is formed through conversations that we've maybe had about a specific topic or specific idea, and it somehow sits in their mind and grows, and they decide that actually they would really like to get involved in a project that maybe we can bring this idea to life. So that's a nice organic way. But for the other type, which is where someone has usually heard your music and would like a piece for their band because there was something they found in your music that they enjoyed and the kids enjoyed, then usually I get an email and then I'll set up a phone call just to chat, because I think it's really important to work out what it is that they want, because what piece did they listen to? Did they listen to a piece from 10 years ago, which maybe isn't quite how you write anymore? Is it that they've heard a particular soloist play a certain piece and they're looking for the excitement that soloist brought out in a band piece? So kind of finding out where they come from is very, very important. And then trying to find if we have some common ground. I don't just like saying yes to a commission and then working out what it's going to be. I want it to be a process where all involved are, as much as possible, bought into it. I truly believe that, my whole sort of mantra is that I love music, and I believe everybody else can love music, and I believe music can change the world, which may all sound a little bit, pie in the sky, but I do think that's the way I see the world. And so if I can't write a piece of music or find some ground with a commissioning ensemble where actually they can be in love with music through what I write and spread the love of music to those who listen to it and perform it, that whether it's parents, whether it's on TV, whether it's, whatever, then maybe that's not a commission for me. I wouldn't be as fully invested in it as I would if I was able to really convey all those things about love for music. So that's a big part of it. Of course, there's always a business side to it as well, where you have to work out exactly when they want the piece for, when can you get the piece ready for, and hopefully those two things line up. You work out whether you can work out a fee structure that works for them and works for you. All those kind of business things, which, to be honest with you, I don't really like dealing with. I'd rather just write music for free and my mortgage company let me have my house for free. But it doesn't quite work out like that. So we have to charge, and I'm never comfortable discussing fees, but I kind of got around that by having a pretty sort of set fee and letting people know that's what it is, and we can go from there. Now, sometimes it doesn't work out to be that set fee. Sometimes it works out more, sometimes it works out less. But I'm a big believer that once you say yes to a commission, the fee is entirely irrelevant. Your commitment to do your best is that.
Right. Absolutely. So with all of this work that you have as a self-published composer, how do you find a work-life balance?
This was something I struggled with at the start of being a self-published composer. That is somebody who is by themselves pretty much most of the day, all day, every day. And you're alone with your own thoughts. And I think that is a significant challenge. I really do. And I was speaking to someone, a young lady from Toronto, who's just taken the decision to leave her post as a band director and focus full-time on her composition career. And she was asking maybe about some of the changes to your life that happen. And I said, well, the biggest one is that you don't get to speak to anyone. You are not speaking to a class of 30 kids and then seeing other teachers throughout the day. You're kind of by yourself, and that comes with its own pressures. You have to take care of your mental health, and so it's important. The work-life balance for me is important in that I have to make sure that there is a balance. But a lot of my friends are part of my job. I work with a lot of friends, and so actually, it's not so much about work-life balance, because I don't really feel like composing's work. I feel, to use your soccer analogy from earlier, I feel what those kids must feel like, growing up kicking a ball around, then all of a sudden you're getting to do it for a career. for a living, and that's what it kind of feels like to me. And so I don't feel like it's a work balance, but I do find it's a social balance. You have to make sure that you spend time with people, and so I've always got a lunch on the go, or a Skype call, or FaceTime with some friends back at home, and so I think they're the things that are important rather than a work-life balance for me personally, because I can't work enough. I love it.
So we talked a little bit about competition earlier on, and I ask this of all my guests these days. Where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
The measure of the experience shouldn't be whether you win or not. And that's probably where the line for me personally would be in terms of a healthy competition. That is to say, does winning mean everything to you, and coming second mean absolute desolation? Because if that's the case, then maybe we've lost the point of music, because again, as musicians, our job isn't to play the trumpet or to compose music or to play the piano or to play the flute. It is all the time to convey our love for music to everyone around us. And if we're doing something that isn't part of that, then for me personally, that doesn't fit in what I think about music. So I know there's a lot of competitions that get taken very seriously in the brass bands in the UK, and for sure over here in North America, Facebook gets pretty tasty at times when there's when it's competition season.
Yep.
And so I do understand all that, and certainly there's an argument to be made that competition drives excellence in performance. It keeps standards very, very high, and for that we should be grateful. But yeah, I think competition without the goal of music being the key to what you're doing is probably where the line is for me.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Another difficult question, a broad question. What do you think are the big challenges that we're facing in music and music education in the 21st century?
Relevance, I think. We are almost our own worst enemies. I think we often talk about why music's important, and it's always answers, I see it in classrooms wherever I go. There's always a pamphlet or a poster that says music is important because it helps your kid be better at math, or helps your kid's coordination, or whatever it may be. And I kind of wonder whether at the basketball gym, as opposed to saying your kid should do music because basketball because it'll help your kid's coordination for playing the clarinet. We almost sit on one side of the fence, and it's the wrong side of the fence. We've got to do a better job of explaining why music is relevant. And not just music, but why the music that we're talking about is relevant. Because, of course, we're surrounded, we're flooded by music, and frankly, we're drowning in a lot of bad music all around us all the time. So, finding the relevance and finding some way that we can make society understand quality is kind of the next big step. I don't have an idea how to do that, unfortunately, because that's huge.
Yeah, we're all striving for that. That whole idea of music being auxiliary to things, when music by itself is valuable, and that's something that we really need to drive home.
Big time.
What advice would you give your younger self? You can go back and fix some things, or redo some things, or give yourself a nudge in a different direction.
Younger self, it was interesting on your sort of list of potential questions you sent through. The question was, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self? And I sat there thinking about that. And I look back and I went to a real elite college of music. It was incredible. The opportunities were second to none. The teaching and tuition available were just stunning. And I don't think I really was prepared for that. I don't think I came from a background that really had prepared me to understand what that opportunity was. I just kind of flitted through it, really. And so I'd go back and I'd do college again, and man, would I learn so much more. I really would. But I think we'd all say that, right?
There's that old idiom about youth is wasted on the young, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I kind of feel that I worked out not so long back, really, about I'm always kind of a little bit uncomfortable with any kind compliment compliments or praise, because to me, and I think I touched on this briefly earlier, that music's always been there, and in fact, more than just music, composing's always been there. I remember writing music when I was, 5, 6, 7. Now, and to me, I've always been able to do it, and so I never could work out why. Almost we needed lessons, but I couldn't work out what the deal was, and I wish I'd worked out a long time ago in life that not everyone can compose, and that to people it does seem remarkable, or it does seem exceptional, or it does seem something beyond what they can understand. But I wish there was a way that I could have understood earlier that that's what people understand, and that actually I'm just different. We're just different, right? That composing was something that was always there. Just as, the sky is blue, I could compose. And I wish I'd understood that, because I think I'd have been a better student, a better learner.
Yeah, and that's a really hard thing. I know a lot of composers and performers struggle with the praise for what they do. And, it's so difficult sometimes just to simply say thank you. Absolutely.
Because actually by getting to be a professional at what we do, part of that is understanding that pretty much we always suck,
Right. That's the state of being.
Suck. The next piece will suck, but it sucks a lot less than the piece before. That's just the constant way that we look for improvement, and we have drive and desire, and that's kind of a difficult thing for people to understand.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's certainly something that I've struggled with, is being able to take praise and to take, to be gracious. Not that I was doing it intentionally. It's just that I felt uncomfortable by it. It made me, like, well, I tried, it's not perfect. And that's what I will say. Well, it's not perfect. And, that's actually insulting the person who gives you the praise. You think about it.
Absolutely. It completely is. And it took me a long time to really work this out. And I think the only way I can really explain it is the way I just did, that it's actually akin to me to something that everybody would do. To me, that was a great piece, Pete. What I hear is the same as if someone said, Pete, that was a great 5-meter walk you did down the corridor there. I mean, we know how to walk down a corridor.
Right.
You don't need praise for it. Right. That's the only way I can really explain it.
So if you had one last piece to conduct or to listen to or to engage with from the wind and brass repertoire, what would that piece be?
That's a great question. So the answer to what my favorite piece would be versus what the last piece would be are kind of different. I think my favorite would be Stravinsky's Symphonies of Winds. That's an easy one. I think if I had the chance to listen to one more piece, what would I listen to? I tell you what it would be. I think it would be Gone by Scott McAllister. I think that is truly a masterwork, and it's just so beautifully simple. And very rarely do you hear a piece of music that communicates like that, and the composer's heart is on show like that, and it is just simply stunning.
So is knowing that this is going to come out in the end of January 2017 and live on the internet for quite some time, is there anything that you'd like to share or promote?
There's a couple of neat things coming up over the next year that I'll throw out there. The first thing is, at the end of January, I've got a piece being recorded and premiered down at Arizona State. Melanie Brooks, who's a doctoral grad assistant down there, who's an incredible person and incredible musician and thinks far smarter thoughts than most people you meet. She's got this wonderful project happening, which is sort of like a mini concerto thing, where the soloist would be a first-year player, and the accompaniment would maybe be a grade 3 style band accompaniment that could be a community band or a school band. And I heard a talk about it, and I thought, what an empowering thing that would be for those young first-year kids to be able to play that piece. And so I've written a small piece for that. I kind of chickened out of doing a wind or brass instrument, but I did piano. So it's a little 3-minute piano solo piece with wind ensemble accompaniment, and I really can't wait to hear that. That's I always think that the easier the music should be, and I say easier with the bunny ears, to perform, I think the harder it is to write. So that kind of took me quite a long time of making sure that I'd got that right, or at least as right as I can. So that's neat. I know there's a couple of other neat things coming up this year. Pat Sheridan is premiering a new piece with the Air Force Band in a couple of weeks. Ryan Anthony is recording my trumpet concerto that I wrote for him this year, and I'll be down in Florida at CBDNA Regional for Robert Ambrose and Georgia State University's performance of a big piece of mine called Fragile Oasis, which I'm really, really very much looking forward to. So it's going to be an exciting few months ahead, and then there's plenty more coming up over the rest of the year.
Two things in there. One is that I'm charmed that you mentioned the piece for a beginning instrument first before you mentioned Pat Sheridan, Ryan Anthony, because those are, of course, two of the great brass players in the world. And also, you mentioned that it's harder to write a piece that's easier. And this is something that came up in my conversation with Johan de May. He said the same thing to me, and John Mackey just said the same thing on Facebook. And just really quickly, why do you think that is?
I think that what you have to do as a composer, when you've got a blank canvas and you can do what you want, when you're writing a symphony for the greatest bands on the planet, you can pretty much write what you want, and as long as it's within actual human capability, it will be played. And so your thoughts about a particular effect that may be very difficult to produce, well, that's okay. They'll find a way. They'll do it. Now, if you're working with 6 notes and a very limited amount of a very limited rhythmic palette, you've got to be able to reduce your language down from complex rhythmic ideas and maybe full harmonies or solo voices in particular instruments that maybe you wouldn't have in those younger bands. And you've got to find a way of still being yourself, the composer, the person, through a very, very small palette.
Interesting.
It's a huge challenge, and it's one I really enjoy because it's one that makes me really question every note and justify the existence of everything that I want. I'm not saying I'd ever leave something out because I felt it was potentially a little bit too hard. In fact, I'd leave it in because I think sometimes the challenge is good. But I want to make sure that whatever I put in there is in there for a specific reason that I want it. Rather than sometimes we can just get a bit. We can just enjoy being able to have our pieces performed by high quality university ensembles a bit too much and almost forget that we're still writing for humans.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually I find writing for young band to be pretty natural for me.
Right.
It's interesting because it's like it goes back to our discussion earlier about composing and walking. I don't know. It's just it doesn't seem as hard, but yet I hear this all the time, and so it just gets me back to that conversation we had earlier.
Well, and I think it comes down to an individual language. I think I look at I had a performance of my symphony just before Christmas over at the University of Toronto with Gillian McKay, who's just an incredible conductor, human, musician, everything. And we were sat talking about this, and the last movement is basically lots of long notes. There's lots of long notes in my music. And, you tend to sort of look on the page and see those and think that that's pretty easy to play. Well, I'd argue that that's harder to play than fast notes. And so kind of you've got to, that's a strange issue when you come to write something that's easy, that almost it has to look harder, mm-hmm. which is strange. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, that is the trick, right? To make something easy sound hard or sound difficult or feel challenging to the students. How do you get syncopation when you can't write an eighth note? Those are the challenges I face sometimes.
Absolutely. That's 100% of the challenge. How do you get what you actually want from the palette that you've got to work with? And that's a truly difficult skill. And I think some people's language fits better with that than others. Some people are naturally better at that than others. And I think you mentioned John and Johan, and I would fit into what I'm just about to say as well, which is I don't think either of those have ever spent a huge amount of time in the classroom. And so I tend to find that a lot of composers who are really good at writing that music for sort of beginner level bands have spent time studying it and playing it on a practical level, conducting it on a practical level.
Yeah,
and
I'd agree.
That's hugely significant advantage because there's a more natural flow that comes from it, I think.
Yeah, I think and just kind of going through a little mental inventory, thinking about all the composers who were most prolific for young band, most of them were teachers at some point, junior high or high school teachers.
Yeah.
Many. Yeah, well, this has been great, Pete. Lots of interesting things we've discussed and lots of thoughtful answers. I appreciate your time. How can people get in touch with you?
Easiest way is through my website, which is meechanmusic.com, and my email's on there, and phone number, the correct GPS coordinates if you really want to come around to my house and have a beer with me.
Not right now in Winnipeg. It's cold.
Yeah, we'd have to have it inside.
Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was great fun. Thank you so much.